Shalom Aleichem, welcome. I'm Lisa Newman, the Yiddish Book Center's Director of Publishing and Public Programs. As always, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our virtual theater for this evening's program, Murder in Manchuria, the true story of a Jewish virtuoso, Russian fascists, a French diplomat, and a Japanese spy in occupied China with Scott Seligman. Before we get started, a couple of reminders. Your video will be off and your audio will be muted throughout the program. You may send us your questions via the question panel located at the lower right of your screen. We ask that you keep your questions short and refrain from comments so we can try to get through all of the questions. I assure you, this is a very packed theater this evening, virtual, thank goodness, because we wouldn't have all fit into our regular theater. I'm delighted to introduce Scott Seligman. Scott is a national award-winning writer with special interest in both Jewish and Chinese history. A former corporate executive, he spent much of his career in Taiwan, Hong Kong, and China. He has also worked as a legislative assistant to a member of the U.S. Congress, lobbied the Chinese government on behalf of American business, managed a multinational public relations agency in China, served as a spokesperson and communications director for a Fortune 500 company, and taught English in Taiwan and Chinese in Washington, D.C. He holds an undergraduate degree in American history from Princeton and a master's degree from Harvard. Scott has written 4 books on early Chinese American history, and his first Jewish-themed book, The Great Kosher War of 1902, won gold medals in 2021 Independent Publisher Book Awards and the 2021 Reader Views Literary Award, and was a finalist in the 2020 National Jewish Book Awards. Welcome, I should say, welcome back, Scott, with your second book.
Thank you.
Great to have you here, and I turn the program over to you.
Okay, well, let me share my screen, and if I can figure out how to do that. Where is the? Here we go. Screen share. No. I'm sorry, we're having an immediate glitch in screen share.
No worries, folks. It worked before, so I assure you it will work again.
I'm trying to figure out where to do it here. Share screen. There we go. Sorry, everybody. Okay, there we go. Are you looking at my slides now? I hope. Lisa, are you? We good?
Yes, we're all good.
All right, folks. Sorry.
Onward, no worries.
Onward and upward.
Technology is always crazy making.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for being here. I'll plan to speak for about 25 minutes or so and be very happy to take your questions at the end. But first, a shout out to Lisa, to Elizabeth Carteropoli, and to Sylvia Peterson, and also the rest of their colleagues at the wonderful Yiddish Book Center for hosting this event this evening. And as Lisa mentioned, this is my second appearance at the center for me. The first was in 2020 when the Great Kosher Meat War of 1902 was launched as well. This book, Murder in Manchuria, was kind of an attempt to blend 2 of my areas of interest, Chinese and Jewish history. And it's actually not my first Chinese Jewish rodeo, so to speak. Several years ago, I also wrote a piece for The Forward about a fundraiser put on by the Chinese of Lower Manhattan in 1903 for Jewish victims of what was the first major pogrom in Russia of the 20th century, the Kishinev pogrom, where the Chinese basically came and did a benefit performance for the benefit of the Russians who had suffered in the pogrom in Russia, the Russian Jews. And I called it The Night New York's Chinese Went Out for Jews. I'll let you stew on that for a minute. Not everybody gets the joke immediately. And as Lisa said, I've also written 4 books about early Chinese Americans, but this is my first work that's actually set in China from beginning to end. And it arguably got its start in the mid-1990s. I was living in China at the time, and I was one of several people in the mid-90s who helped establish the liberal Jewish community in Beijing, which we call Keilat Beijing. The congregation embraced expatriate Jews in China from really all over the world, from the Americas, from Europe, from Israel. We had Jews from Australia. We even had Russian Jews there. And we began regular Friday night services in 1995, despite the fact that Judaism is not technically a, quote, recognized religion in China. This was the first organized Jewish community in Beijing in modern times. And since we had no rabbi and it was lay-led, we more or less had to teach ourselves how to run the service. It was the most creative Jewish community I think I've ever participated in. We were very well aware that Jews had preceded us in China, going back actually as far as the 8th century, when it's documented that Jews came from the West via the Silk Road to China. They were Middle Eastern Jews from Iraq, and those communities no longer really exist as such today, although there are remnants of them. But Jews came again in sizable numbers in the 19th and the 20th centuries. And that's when Jews appeared in several of China's Pacific ports, like the ones on the right in the graphic there, Shanghai, Tianjin, and Hong Kong. And the cast of characters then included both Sephardi businessmen from Baghdad and from India, and also Ashkenazic refugees from Russia and from Eastern Europe. And of course, as is well known, many European Jews found refuge in Shanghai during the Second World War. Well, in 1997, several members of the Beijing Jewish community decided to take an extended weekend trip to the city of Harbin in northeast China. The area was formerly known to foreigners as Manchuria. We knew there had been a Jewish presence there at the turn of the 20th century. We wanted to see what was left of it. It only had a period of really about half a century. It started in the very final years of the 19th century, and it was more or less over not long after World War II. As it turned out, there was plenty to see in Harbin. We saw, for example, 2 former synagogues. This one was a hostel for the railroad ministry. This one was a public security club at the time. It's now a museum. We saw a former Jewish school complete with the Star of David right in the fenestration. We saw several formerly Jewish-owned businesses. We ate at an old Jewish-owned restaurant. This was the Jewish hospital. It's now an ophthalmic hospital. And we also saw the remains of the Jewish cemetery. This was far out of town. The graves actually had not been moved. The original cemetery was downtown, but the gravestones were moved here, and they're fairly lovingly cared for now by the municipal authorities. So anyway, I got curious. Who were these Jews? Why did they come to China? How did they get there? And what caused them to leave? And as it happens, at precisely the same time that my grandparents were making the trek from the Pale of Settlement, in their case, Belarus, or modern-day Belarus, to the United States, there was another path out of Russia taken by many, many fewer Jews than came to North America. And that path went essentially in precisely the opposite direction. Now, this is a map which shows Manchuria in the middle in green. It encompassed today's 3 provinces and a little bit of another one in modern day China, Liaoning, Jilin, and Heilongjiang provinces in northeast China, and also a little part of parts of today's Inner Mongolia as well. And because of its location, between the late 19th century and the end of World War II, it had the misfortune of being coveted by 3 different countries. It was part of China, which had the strongest historical claim to it. But China was weak. It had just been through the Opium Wars. The dynasty was on its last legs. And in fact, within about a decade, more than a decade, the Qing dynasty would in fact fall to revolutionaries. But because of its strategic location, it fit very handily into the plans of both Russia and also Japan. Both of them wanted to use it to expand their spheres of influence. Briefly, Japan wanted the wealth and the natural resources. It also wanted a place to resettle some of its overcrowded population. That was the Japanese view. And what Russia wanted was access to a warm water port on the Pacific, which Port Arthur, today's Dalian is the Chinese word for it, would have provided them. They had Vladivostok on that coast, but Vladivostok froze up for several months during the winter, and Port Arthur did not. So this would have given them basically 365 days a year access to the South China Sea, to the Japanese Sea, and to the Pacific Ocean. Well, I'm not going to go into the blow-by-blow of the Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War. They were all fought right around this time. But suffice it to say that Manchuria was fought over and it was invaded. And Russia acquired a concession through Manchuria in exchange for its pledge to help defend the Chinese against the Japanese if they ever came in again. Russia got a concession to extend its Trans-Siberian Railway all the way to Vladivostok. Now, they could have done that by going through Russian territory, but it was a much more direct route by going through Manchuria. They saved about more than 500 miles, I think, of track. So they wanted this corridor, and they got it. And in the corridor, they built what became known as the China Eastern Railway, which was the end of the Trans-Siberian Railway, ended in Vladivostok. And subsequently, they got an agreement to build a second one, the South Manchuria Railway, which went all the way down to Port Arthur, which was a warm water port. So Russia was establishing itself in Manchuria at the end of the 20th century. Sorry, end of the 19th century. Now, Harbin itself was a tiny little fishing village before all this happened. But where the railroad crossed the Sungari River, which is Songhaijiang in Chinese, the Russians built the headquarters of the railway. And that's really how the city of Harbin got established. You know, most Chinese cities have storied histories that date back thousands of years, but Harbin is not one of them. Before 1898, it was nothing. It was really almost nothing there. Russia wanted to cement its hold on the region. It didn't just want a railroad. It really wanted dominance in the region. So it decided to build an industrial and commercial infrastructure throughout this corridor that it had leased from China, with Harbin as its base. And to make that happen, they appealed to Russian businessmen to come out and actually exploit the resources of Harbin. But the response was kind of anemic. And then the Tsar got an idea that there was Russia had a perfect resource to settle and to make the commercial and industrial infrastructure in Harbin bloom. And it was its Jews. Back in Russia, the Jews were, well, I'm sure most of you know the story. They were subject to special taxes. They had school quotas against them. They were banned from some professions. Their sons could be conscripted into the military service as early as age 12 and forced to serve for decades, generally as cannon fodder, never as officers. In fact, that's the reason that my grandfather decided to leave for America. He was actually a deserter, as I learned when somebody in the Minsk archives showed me his draft record from 1904, which included the exact day that he deserted and left for America. Plus, the Jews in Russia were also frequent targets of pogroms, these violent genocidal attacks that were too often sanctioned by the Russian authorities. So it turned out to be a good offer for some Jews. The Tsar offered Jews who were willing to settle in Manchuria essentially deliverance from these restrictions and from persecution. And many Jewish merchants and professionals made their way east. It was Russia without pogroms. And in the first couple of decades of the 20th century, something like 20,000 Jews made their way to Harbin, and they built it into a major city. And that's why Harbin looks a lot more like St. Petersburg than it does most Chinese cities, because it was built by the Russians, it was planned by the Russians, it was settled by the Russians. Okay, well, life for the Jews of Harbin was never paradise, but it was pretty good, and it was a hell of a lot better than life in Russia for the first couple of decades of the 20th century, and many Jewish people prospered there. And among them was a man named Joseph Kaspé. He was a veteran of the Russo-Japanese War, and when it was over and he was released from the service, he didn't see much reason to return home to Russia. He actually stayed in Harbin. He opened up a watch repair shop, which he parlayed into a jewelry shop. By 1913, he had amassed the capital to buy a lot on the main shopping street. The Russians called it Kitaiskaya Street, which translates as Chinese Street. Today, the Chinese call it Zhongyangdajie, which basically means Central Street. But it's still the center of gravity of commercial Harbin. And on this plot of land, he built the first European standard hotel in town. He called it the Hotel Moderne, the modern hotel. It's still standing, and it's actually where we stayed in 1997 when we went up to do our reconnaissance trip to Harbin. But after 1918, which was the Russian Revolution, life for the Jews began to change. That's when, after the revolution, the white Russians, as opposed to the red Russians, the communists, a lot of them fled Russia for their lives. They had their belongings taken away from them. Some of them had been living very, very high in Russia, but all of a sudden they were paupers. Some emerged with their wealth, but most of them lost everything. And so you had an influx of newly impoverished Russians who came into Manchuria, probably like 150,000 of them, maybe a little more than that. And many of them were deeply anti-Semitic. A lot of them blamed the Jews for the Russian Revolution that had impoverished them. And a small number of them set about making the lives of the Jews of Harbin miserable. And that's when the bad times started. Some of them were actually admirers of Mussolini. And they established something that they called the Russian Fascist Party in the early 1930s. It actually had branches all over the world, but the center of gravity was Harbin, China. And it was led by a man named Konstantin Rodzaevsky. It was sworn to the quixotic effort of overthrowing the Soviet Union. Harbin was used as a base for sending people into Russia to distribute anti-Soviet propaganda and to destabilize the new regime. And in the city itself, Rodzaevsky's men torched the main synagogue and began to carry out targeted kidnappings of local Jews. So it wasn't as much fun after the White Russians came in. But it got worse in 1931, and that's when Japan invaded Manchuria on a pretext. Japan carved the region of Manchuria off from the rest of China. It declared it an independent country, which it called Manchukuo, basically the Manchu country. And this was really prologue for the Japanese plans to expand into the rest of Asia that it pursued during World War II. And the Japanese expected to milk Manchuria of its wealth, make it pay for its own colonization, and also generate some capital that Japan could use for the conquest of the rest of Asia, which it more or less carried out to be in World War II. And these new Japanese overlords established a highly corrupt system of government in Manchukuo. And what was really bad for the Jews was that they found common cause with the Russian fascists, whom they recruited to do a lot of their dirty work. Now, the two communities had very different justifications for going after the Jews. The Japanese were not notably anti-Semitic. They didn't know much about Jews. Most of what experience they had was quite little. What they wanted was Manchuria's wealth, and the Jews were an obvious source of it. So the Japanese were interested in fleecing the Jews of Manchuria, but they didn't want their fingerprints on it. The Russians, on the other hand, hated the Jews. As a result of the collaboration between the two, the Jewish community became even more miserable than it had been before. All right, well, now let's try to get to the story. That's enough background. It brings us to the story of Semyon Kaspé, who was Joseph's son. He was a young and very talented concert pianist. He was born in Harbin and trained in France. A lot of the wealthier Jews in Manchuria gave their children basic educations in country, but then they sent them abroad for higher education. And that included Semyon and also his younger brother, Vladimir. Vladimir became an architect. Semyon wanted to be a musician. And he had just returned home in 1933, living with his father in the Hotel Moderne. He was living the life of a bon vivant. He was performing in many Asian cities. He was planning a major concert tour of the United States. And he also was dating. He took up with a woman named Lydia Shapiro, also an acclaimed musician, who had also grown up in Harbin. She's a few years older than he was. And she'd also lived in Europe and had trained there. She, however, was a mother of four. She'd been living with her husband and her family in Japan, but had separated from her husband and returned with four of her children, her four children at the time, to live with her father in Harbin. And Semyon and Lydia were an item. And one evening in 1933, they had a musical evening at the Hotel Moderne, and he was escorting her home in his father's limousine. She only lived a few blocks from the hotel, but this was the chivalrous thing to do. And just as it pulled up in front of her house, the car was attacked and the two were abducted. The car pulled away, sped away. When it got a distance from her home, she was let go, but she was given an outrageous ransom demand that she was instructed to communicate to Semyon's father. It was the equivalent of about $1.4 million in today's dollars. And she was instructed to communicate this to Semyon's father. Semyon himself was taken to a hideout outside of town. Well, Joseph Kaspé, once he discovered that his son was missing, he immediately sought help from the French consulate. Semyon had taken out French citizenship a few years earlier. And it was a smart move for many reasons. He and his brother and his mother, actually, all of them were in Paris at the time. All of them became French citizens. because after the Soviet Union was formed, the Russian Jews who were in China, unless they wanted to apply for Soviet passports, they became stateless. And if they were stateless, they were much more vulnerable to expropriation of their property, things like that, than if they had a passport. So when Semyon and his brother Vladimir became French citizens, Joseph saw the opportunity and he signed all of his property over to his two sons. And the reason was he felt very vulnerable that the Japanese were moving in and trying to take over his hotel. But if it had a French flag flying above it, they were much, much less likely to give him any trouble. And the reason for this was that Japan was looking for international recognition of Manchuria as an independent country. Remember, this piece of China that they had forcibly carved off and declared an independent country, as if it really were independent, as if it were really not just a puppet state of Japan. So they were looking for that kind of recognition, and they didn't want to start up with the European powers. So Joseph Kaspé reasoned, and he was correct, they would be much less likely to mess with him if his hotel was French-owned. So when Semyon was abducted, Joseph went right to the French consulate for help. Well, that's all about that, I think, on that slide. He went to the French consulate for help, and he received help not only from the consul, but also from his deputy, a man named Albert Chambon, who was really the hero of this story. Chambon interceded with the Japanese authorities, seeking their help in the rescue of Semyon. But he quickly realized he was getting the runaround from the authorities, from the police. They were really only pretending to be helpful. And he wound up, when he realized this, he hired his own detectives to find out where Semyon was being held. And they pretty much located him without too much trouble. I'm not going to spoil the book by revealing the whole plot line here. It is something of a nail biter. But the reader will meet some very interesting and improbable characters as the search for the kidnappers goes on, as they're caught and as they're tried in a process that was choreographed by the Japanese military. And briefly, the cast includes Japanese military men who were determined to do their best for Japan, but enrich themselves in the process. There were local Jewish businessmen and Jewish community officers, various white Russian thugs, like this one, happy to do the bidding of the Japanese, especially if it involved going after local Jews. Other Europeans, including diplomats and a particular Italian spy for hire who was working for the Japanese but undermining them whenever he could get away with it. There's even a cameo appearance in the book by Puyi, the deposed boy emperor of China. If you've ever seen that movie, The Last Emperor, this was the little boy who was deposed. He was actually of Manchu extraction. So the Japanese thought of a way to bring him in to try to give some credibility to the idea that this was an independent country. He was initially named the chief executive of Manchuria, and he was eventually promoted to emperor, but he had absolutely no power. He basically had to do what the Japanese told him to do. And the book takes the reader through the search for Semyon, his captors, the capture, the eventual trial of the kidnappers, and how the whole process was manipulated by the Japanese authorities, who didn't really want to punish the criminals because they felt that but on the other hand, they didn't want to punish the criminals because they had use for them and there was an alliance between them. And they figured if they cut bait on these guys, then they wouldn't get future cooperation from the Russians. But on the other hand, they felt that if Manchuria was going to be recognized by the rest of the world, they had to be seen as committed to justice and not just as a puppet Japanese dictatorship, which is what it was. So that was their dilemma. Now, finally, I want to tell you a bit about the making of the book. This was the most challenging book I think I've ever attempted. The research was more complex than really anything I've done up till now. I'm usually highly dependent on newspapers to construct a narrative. And there were newspaper articles, but not all that many covered Manchuria that survived and that are accessible. And many had little of the kind of detail that writers like me cover. Chinese archives, for example, are essentially closed to foreign researchers, and the Russian archives were not forthcoming either. So I did several things. I reached out to a few people who I knew were knowledgeable about Harbin history. 3 in particular, none of whom I have ever met, by the way, were extremely helpful when I contacted them. And the first one is an Israeli scholar by the name of Dan Ben Kanan, who may well be the only long-term Jewish resident of Harbin at this writing. And he's surely the most knowledgeable about his Jewish history. He's written about the Kaspé story as a case study. He's written a lot of books about Jewish Manchuria and is generous to a fault with his research and his sources. He was a great source for me. The second is a woman named Yonara Klebcha. She's a Russian descendant of Harbin residents, not Jews, just Harbin Russians. And she has a blog about the history of Harbin that I happened on only when I learned how to search for the name Kaspé in Russian on the web. It's all in Russian, but I wrote her in English, and between the two of us and Google Translate, we've had a robust correspondence. She helped me with a lot of information also that she had picked up from the Russian newspapers that she had access to that I did not. And the third is a Japanese woman named Noriko Uchiyama Valuyen. She's a Japanese scholar married to a Russian who was actually working on a book about one of Semyon Kaspé's kidnappers. She also was generous with her articles, her sources, and her advice. She's fluent in Russian. She's written a couple of articles based on the contemporary Russian newspapers that covered the case, but she writes in Japanese. I was also able to get hold of some government files, some scholarly articles, and most importantly, some memoirs that were left behind by people who had been directly or indirectly involved in the drama. And I want to give you a sense of the secondary sources that I consulted. They were actually in 8 languages. Several were in English. One very useful one was a work by Amleto Vespa, who was an Italian spy who had been working for the Chinese, but when the Japanese came in, they informed him that he was now working for them. And if he didn't want to do that, they would be very happy to kill his family. So he was forced to work with the Japanese. He undermined them wherever he could get away with it. And he left a really juicy memoir about his experience. He played a role in the story, and he wrote soon after it was over. This was really the first memoir that came out about the Kaspé case. And then there's a biography of Vespa in Italian by an Italian named Francesco Totoro, The Spying Game, Amleto Vespa's Chinese Affair. He wrote it in Italian, but I was fortunate enough to find an English translation of it. And that gave me a little bit more background than Vespa himself. Vespa himself wasn't entirely reliable in his memoir. He wrote it consciously, conscious of the fact that he wasn't necessarily out of danger. He was living in Shanghai at the time, and sure enough, the Japanese eventually took Shanghai, and he is believed to have been assassinated by the Japanese military, either in Taiwan or in the Philippines. Nobody's entirely sure. This is a dossier of dispatches that was written by Louis Reynaud, who was the consul general in Harbin, to his superiors in Beijing and to the foreign ministry back in Paris. Nobody knew it was there, but it was discovered by a researcher and declassified and released in 2004. It consists primarily of reports about Chambon's investigation, his observations about the lack of cooperation he was getting from the Japanese authorities, and his suspicions about their actual involvement in the abduction. And this file also includes letters exchanged between Semyon Kaspé and his father while Semyon was in captivity. This did my author's heart good because it allowed me to use some direct quotations from the protagonists. I had letters that Semyon wrote and letters that his father wrote back to him. Now, I do read French, but to make sure I got an entirely accurate understanding of this 80-page file, all of it was in French. And it was a scan of a carbon copy, so it was really hard, not susceptible to just optical character recognition on the computer. What I did was I read it in French into my iPhone, corrected it, and then put it through 2 online translators, Google Translate and DeepL. And I think I achieved about 98% understanding of what was in it, with many thanks to my high school French teachers. May they both rest in peace. Then there was Russian. Sorry, we're still in French. I discovered that I did not have a usable image of Albert Chambon for the book, and I really wanted to find one. So I made several inquiries to locate his family members. And with the help of a friend in France, I located his son Bernard and his daughter Isabelle. And they not only sent me the photo that's in the book, but they also graciously offered me their father's unpublished manuscript, written shortly before his death, about his years in China as a young diplomat. All, of course, in French. It added a great deal of background information and set me straight on a few facts that I'd actually gotten wrong. By this time, I had already submitted the manuscript to the publisher. So I begged them to let me recall the manuscript for 1 week just in order to incorporate some of these insights and some of the facts, straighten out some of the facts in the book. And they were very gracious about it. They let me do that. This was a very valuable source. Russian is not one of my languages. In a Russian language book whose name translates as Finale in China, which was a history essentially of Russian immigration to China, written in 1958. The author drew on the unpublished memoirs and the diaries of a police inspector named Martineau, who actually was one of the kidnappers. He played a central role in the kidnapping, and he knew a great deal of the story. I was fortunate to find an electronic copy online. I ran it through machine translation, which was surprisingly good, and it was not hard to understand exactly what he was saying. There actually wasn't much that survived in Yiddish, even though that was the lingua franca of the Harbin Jews when they weren't speaking Russian. But there were a few extant sources like this one, which is a clip from a Harbin Yiddish newspaper called Far East. I don't know that the whole run of Far East exists anywhere, but here and there you can find a piece. And this was a memoir by Teddy Kaufman, who was born in Harbin in 1924. He was the son of Abraham Kaufman, who was the leader of the Jewish community, who also played a role in the story. This one's in Hebrew. It relates to the history of the Harbin Jewish community in the first half of the 20th century. Hebrew is also not one of my languages, apart from blessing the bread and the wine, but there were plenty of friends who helped me through the memoir. So I think I got what was important about it. There is some Chinese scholarship about the Harbin Jews, like this article, which is the work of a Chinese scholar named Wang Zhijun. And with a good dictionary by my side, I can handle the Chinese. And then finally, Japanese. My friend Noriko sent me this volume. It's called The Harbin Church Garden. This is a 2009 work by a Japanese reporter. It was actually the first study of the Kaspé case in Japanese. I didn't make it through the whole volume, but she told me where to look. And with help, I was able to figure out also what he was saying. So 8 different languages. In revisiting this cold case, I made an attempt to answer some questions that really were never addressed. Most notably, who ordered the kidnapping of Semyon Kaspé? I've tried to tell about the Kaspé case in the context of the larger story of the lives of the 20,000 Russian Jews who called Harbin home for about half a century, from their arrival in the late 19th century to their departure. Most of the people left in the run-up to the Second World War. And in spite of a grand Japanese scheme called the Fugu Plan, which was an idea of not only keeping them there, but also inviting other European Jews into Japanese occupied lands and using them to help them with their later conquest of Asia. The Kaspé case is generally considered to be one of the milestones that accelerated the exodus of the Harbin Jews, who concluded from the way that it was handled that they could not count on protection or justice from the Japanese. And as it turned out, they did far better than their compatriots who had remained behind in Russia, a large number of whom, of course, were victims of the Nazis. They scattered to other Asian cities like Shanghai and Hong Kong. They went to the Holy Land, they went to the Americas, to Australia, and went on with their lives, most of them. Now, let me stop here and unshare my screen with thanks for your attention. The book has a lot of moving parts, and I'd be very happy to answer your questions if you have them. So let me figure out how to unshare the screen. And how do you do that, Scott? There we go. Unshare? No, unshare. Stop share. There we go. Okay.
Fascinating as always, Scott. I could be watching a movie, but this is way much better. Thank you so much. So I'm going to go. You've actually connected a lot of people with family history here. It's kind of fascinating, the way that happens. First question is: they moved the stones, not the graves.
The Jewish cemetery was downtown Harbin. The land was too valuable to leave as a cemetery, especially since there were no more Jews left after the communists took over. And the decision was made to move the gravestones. They did not bother to move the graves. And actually, they didn't move all the gravestones. People actually had to pay for that to happen. But they moved it way out of town. I think that the Harbin authorities decided that the Jewish presence could be leveraged for Jewish tourism in the present. They wanted Jewish tourists to come and see Harbin. So they felt the need to be respectful of the Jewish sites. In fact, one of those 2 synagogues that I showed you in the earlier slide has been made into a museum of the history of the Jewish people of Harbin. The problem is they don't have very many artifacts. So there's lots of, representations, sculptures of Jewish kids sitting at desks and things like that. I'm not sure how much you actually learn from that museum. But in the case of the cemetery, they moved the gravestones. They're all orderly in line. They're mostly in Russian. But they didn't bother in most cases to move the graves. Semyon Kaspé's grave is there. And I didn't see it at the time, but I know that it's there because somebody went through and took all pictures of all the gravestones, and I found it online.
Next question is, I thought Japanese were sympathetic to Jews because Jacob Schiff supported them during the Russo-Japanese War. No, question mark?
Yes, actually, that's true. The Japanese, up until this time, had really only two experiences with Jews, and Jacob Schiff supporting them through that war was one of them. That persuaded them that Jews were international financiers and potentially powerful people that it would be nice to have on their side, or at least be able to use. The other influence, unfortunately, was a Japanese translation of the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, which they originally got in Russia when they were fighting with the White Russians against the Soviets right after the 1918 revolution. And there was a Japanese translation made of it. So basically, they had the idea that the Jews wanted to take over the world, that they were powerful, that they had that they were internationalists, that they were a worldwide force, and the Japanese wanted to figure out a way to harness them to their benefit. In fact, that plan I mentioned at the very end, where they were in fact inviting European Jews, the ones the Nazis wanted out or wanted to kill, to come to their occupied lands in China and settle there. The name of the plan was the Fugu Plan, and Fugu is the Japanese word for a blowfish. If you know anything about Japanese cuisine, blowfish is both a delicacy, but also a very dangerous thing to eat if it's not prepared exactly right by a very experienced chef. If you eat one portion, I think it's the bladder or something, you die immediately. It's poisonous. So the idea was that these Jews are powerful, they're interesting, they're nutritious, as it were, but they're also potentially deadly. So they have to be managed and they have to be very, very carefully observed. That was the idea.
I noticed that the tombstones were written in Hebrew and Russian, not Chinese. Were Jews ever part of the Chinese culture? This is a long question. Or did they always feel as foreigners? Also, there was an architect in Mexico who arrived from Europe mid-20th century, very famous, Vladimir Kaspé. It turns out he is the brother, amazing story. He built gorgeous buildings. One of them was the Centro Deportivo Israelita, JCC, which is a fantastic example of mid-century architecture. Thanks for this. It's so interesting.
That's all correct about Vladimir. I don't think he had any children. I tried like hell to see if I could find them, but I wasn't able to. There was also some misinformation about Semyon's mother, who was, in many sources, was reported to have died at Auschwitz, which made no sense at all. She actually died in France. But Vladimir got out of France, married, and then eventually made his way to Mexico, where he was indeed a noted architect. That's correct. He never spoke publicly again about his brother and the fate of his brother. So there was no memoir there, unfortunately, that I could use. The Hebrew on that.
Yeah.
Chinese, if you went to school in one of the schools in Harbin, you actually did have to take a minor in Chinese. It was taught. And therefore, I believe Semyon Kaspé probably could speak some basic Chinese. But I think it was probably, there really wasn't all that much mixing of the populations. I suspect it was the Chinese to communicate with your servants that they knew. I didn't find a lot of intermarriage with Chinese, although I'm sure there was some. And they really, I think, lived as separate cultures. I think the lingua franca among the Russian Jews was Yiddish, but they were all fluent in Russian as well. And they read Russian newspapers, the same as the White Russians. They read all the same newspapers, they went to all the same concerts, same Russian music, same Russian cuisine in the restaurants. But again, they were Jews and they knew it and they were separate.
I'm sitting here with my husband, the grandson of a Mennonite couple who fled Siberia for Harbin in 1929 and got out of Manchuria just before the arrival of the Japanese in 1930. In your research for this book, did you come across anything about the Mennonite community in Harbin at this time? Many thanks for your book and talk. Can't wait to read it.
I did not. There were a lot of other miscellaneous populations in Harbin at the time. There were Spaniards and there were you could actually buy baklava, on the street corners. So there have to have been some Middle Eastern representatives as well. Lots of different, very, very small populations. But most of the population was Russian and Chinese, and then eventually the Japanese who came in as well. But unfortunately, no, I didn't find anything on the Mennonites.
My father was raised in Harbin, and my uncle both had his sugar factory seized by the Japanese and was the subject of a kidnapping effort. With the exception of my father, the rest of the family remained in Harbin until 1956 when they were expelled. Why didn't more of the Jews leave earlier?
Well, they had already started to leave after the Japanese came in. The Kaspé case, I cannot say that the Kaspé case was why they left, but it accelerated the outflow. What happened was, I mean, up until the Russian Revolution, it was a pretty damn good place to live if you were a Russian Jew. It was certainly better than being back in the Pale of Settlement. And so a lot of Jews made a lot of money and they were prosperous. It was only when the Russians came in, the white Russians came in, and then the Japanese came in and used them that it became really dangerous. This is Mr. Grossman who answered that. If you want to write me, I'll see if I can find any newspaper articles about the kidnapping. If you give me the names, I'd be very happy to do it to check for you. Just go to my website, seligmanonline.com, and you can write me through the website. I'll see if I can find anything.
Are there any Kaspé descendants around?
As far as I know, not. Semyon didn't have any. He didn't live long enough. He didn't marry. And Vladimir, as far as I know, did not have any offspring. I was in touch with a couple of people who thought they were related to the Kaspés, but nobody could really document. So unfortunately, that was close to me. I was just happy to find Albert Chambon's kids. This is something I do whenever I'm writing a book. I like to write about dead people because they don't argue with you. But I like to find their descendants because I can usually get more information from the descendants. And very often, I'm the one that gives them more information once I find them. They didn't know what great grandpa did. That was true in the kosher meat book, where everybody I found who was a descendant of one of the women who had been involved in that strike didn't know that Bubby had been involved in it. And I had to tell them. But then they could find a picture or something they could help too.
And one of the fascinating aspects of all of these programs, or many of these programs, is so many of our participants figure out ways that there are these connections, one thing leading to another. And it always is fascinating, and people learn more about their family, or authors like yourselves have other leads into related subjects. Let's see. Why is the word Manchuria spelled in special type, the C and the H on the
And
cover?
my agent didn't like that either. It's just a design element. I didn't like it initially, and then I decided I did. But if you know anything about the publishing business, if you're the author, you get to decide what's inside the book. The publisher gets to decide what's on the book, on the cover and on the back cover. If you really scream bloody murder, as actually I did with this cover in particular, the designers had originally come up with a Chinese language document they were sort of screaming back. And I said, you can't use that. It's got nothing to do with the story. And they said, well, it's just there for design. I said, no, you don't understand. People who speak Chinese are going to read this book, and they're going to know that that's had nothing to do with it. It was some document from Shanghai. That one I insisted I was going to win because I wasn't going to allow that to happen. But the C and the H didn't bother me.
We'll just let that go. Where can we purchase your book? We'll tell you at the end, but we'll remind you now it's available at shop.yiddishbookcenter.org and wherever fine books are sold, or drop on by the Yiddish Book Center and buy it in our bookstore and visit our exhibition. It looks like Semyon died the year he was kidnapped. Did I miss something?
No, you didn't miss something. He was in captivity for about 3 months before they killed him. And there was a lot of questions about whether he really needed to die. His father could not come up with the ransom money that they were demanding. There was negotiation. They lowered the ransom demands. And there was a popular impression that Joseph Kaspé was playing cagey and just trying to negotiate down the amount that he was going to have to pay for his son's freedom. Even after they sent a piece of Semyon's ear to him to show that they meant business. In fact, it was the Depression. Joseph had mortgaged his theater and his hotel. The banks were not going to give him any more money, and the demand was too high. And so he was unable to pay the ransom. So there was that, and also the fact that probably Semyon in his captivity had learned too much about the identity of his captors to have been safely released after a ransom was paid. And so at one point or another, somebody put a bullet through him. But it was 3 months, and it was indeed the same year he was kidnapped.
What happened to Manchuria after World War II? I should know.
Well, after World War II, the Japanese lost. They had to give back a lot of the territory that they took, and Manchuria basically reverted to China. It was initially the Republic of China, which is the government that we now have on Taiwan. And then when the communists took over, it became part of communist China. And in fact, the Russians, they took Puyi, the emperor, they took him captive, brought him back to Russia. And they were initially unwilling to give him back to the Republic of China, but they gave him back to the communists eventually. So it became part of China. Again, it's now 3 northeastern provinces of China. Think of it as Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. It's kind of the same part of China as New England is.
Was the man known as Two-Gun Cohen active in this area during this
No,
time?
I don't think he was in Manchuria. There's a great biography of Two-Gun Cohen, but no, I think he was in other parts of China. He was working with the Chinese mostly. He's got a great name.
Yeah, it did. Doesn't the Modern Hotel have showcases filled with Jewish artifacts?
They do. They have some things. They have a lot of really bad pictures of the Kaspé family and pretty much anything that they could grab. You know, there isn't a Jewish archive in Harbin. I don't know anyone who's ever been allowed to see it, including Dan Ben-Kanan, who I think is probably the world's foremost authority on the Harbin Jewish community. And so they do have some records, I think, from the Jewish community, if they want to show them, if they want to use them, but they're not open to foreign researchers. I imagine that there were some artifacts left behind in the hotel, but like I say, the ones in the museum are not inspiring. They're just kind of everyday items that might have been in a Jewish home in Manchuria.
Did the Jews living in China during the time of this account serve as a precursor to Shanghai taking Jews in during World War II?
Well, it wasn't exactly a precursor. It was sort of going on at the same time. I don't know what else to say about that. It wasn't a precursor. It was happening in Shanghai. And again, some of the Harbin Jews eventually went to Shanghai as well. There were Harbin Jews who remained during World War II, and they were not abused by the Japanese. In fact, the Japanese sort of reached out to them. They actually set up a sort of a puppet organization of Jewish communities of Asia as part of this Fugu plan idea of, how can we use the Jews? So the Harbin Jews did better than the Shanghai Jews did during World War II. Shanghai Jews were ghettoized, and that didn't happen in Harbin.
We've got 2 very similar questions here. What happened to Lydia's 4 children? And what happened to the girlfriend and her children?
What happened? Okay. Lydia's children, many of them are still alive. I was in touch with 3 of them. One of them actually wrote 2 of them actually wrote memoirs, which I also used. That's where I got most of my information on Lydia. Also, one of them graciously lent me a couple of photographs of Lydia, 2 of which I think had Lydia and Semyon together. They were bicultural. They grew up in Japan. They spoke fluent Japanese. One in particular is an attorney who lives in New York City who did a lot of work with the Japanese after the war. As far as I know, they're all still alive. Lydia herself, I'm sorry, the rest of the question.
Yeah.
She came to the United States, continued to be a pianist, and lived and died in America. It was over.
There's another long question that I'm not going to read. And again, it's somebody with interesting connections to this. But I want to say for anybody out there who wants to get in touch directly, you can email us at programs@yiddishbookcenter.org, and I will forward any of your correspondence on for response. Okay, so that's again programs@yiddishbookcenter.org, and know that your email communication will be forwarded for reply. Where did they find Semyon's body?
It was moved several times. Once they caught one of the captors, and they let him go, he was no longer told exactly where the body was when they had to move him. But they used him to figure out. There were I think 3 different locations, and they were each further from Harbin all along the railroad that went southeast of Harbin. He was found in a shallow grave, um, emaciated, gangrenous. In fact, when they brought his body back to Harbin for a funeral, for a proper Jewish funeral, his father insisted on viewing the body, and it was the worst thing he ever could have done. He essentially went mad after that. It was never the same. After they sold the hotel, moved to France, and that's where he died. But Amleto Vespa had a real description of it in his memoir about how awful it was to have seen that body. And he said, I was glad he was at peace because he wouldn't have wanted to occupy that body another minute. Very sad.
What actually happened to the captors if jailing them wasn't an option?
Well, they were jailed, and it took a year before they were brought to trial. The Japanese wanted to downplay it. They wanted to preserve their relationship with the Russians. They wanted to kind of make the whole thing go away. But the Jewish community was not about to let that happen. In particular, the Shanghai Jewish community was very vocal about this. And they managed to raise hackles throughout the Jewish world. And Japanese diplomats got lobbied in America, they got lobbied in China, that people wanted to see justice done for what had happened to Semyon Kaspé. So the Japanese stewed on it for about a year before they even brought charges against these guys. They were in jail, they were incarcerated, but they weren't tried yet. And when the prosecutor came up with the charges, the world was appalled. They basically were asking for mercy for these guys because they had acted out of patriotism. Now, interestingly enough, it wasn't even patriotism for Manchuria; it was patriotism for Mother Russia. Their argument was that Joseph Kaspé was a communist, which there's no evidence he ever was. He was a capitalist, and that they had to go after. And then he had sold artifacts belonging to Russian people. The Russian people were crying for the artifacts and the jewelry. That he had even sold the Tsar's jewelry from the Tsar's family. So they really, really ginned up a lot of charges on Joseph Kaspé that were not true. And the prosecutor portrayed this as a patriotic act. He couldn't get away from the fact that they'd actually killed somebody, and it was against the law to kill somebody. But they were trying to get lenient sentences for them. And the way the Japanese handled the legal system was when they marched into Manchuria was they didn't replace it overnight with a Japanese system. They used the Chinese judges and the Chinese attorneys who were there, but they put a Japanese in charge of every office to pretty much dictate what was going to happen. So the first trial, there were Chinese judges who presided, and they came up with fairly harsh sentences, including the death penalty for several of the prisoners. Well, and it was technically not an appealable decision, but it had to be rubber stamped by the Supreme Court of Manchuria, which ultimately did not rubber stamp it. Instead, it ordered a new trial in a different court under a different law that didn't have the death penalty assigned. And so they went back and they had another trial. And the other trial, they were found guilty in the other trial, but they were beneficiaries of an amnesty that the emperor had declared when he first took over, so that they didn't have to serve any more time in jail. Several of them were given aliases and moved elsewhere in Manchuria to get out of Harbin, but none of them were killed, except for one was killed by the police in the process of freeing the hostage, but that was all. The other ones basically all escaped. One of them even died in the United States. I think if immigration had known who he was and what he'd done, they probably never would have let him in.
Where is he buried?
Semyon?
Yeah.
In Harbin, in that I'm not sure where he's buried now. I think that there's a building on that site, but his matziva, his stone is in the Jewish cemetery in Harbin. So he was buried there.
Somebody who is claiming ignorance of this, but could you please spell that name that sounded like Toucan Cohen so we can look at
it's Two-Gun, Twogun, Two-Gun Cohen.
Yes.
Look him up on Amazon. I'm sure you'll find the biography that was written about him. He was an interesting character.
And no need to apologize for that question, my friends out there. Someone's asking if there is an audio version scheduled to come out.
Yes, there will be one. A company called Tantor Media.
Okay.
Supposedly, it's going to be out in a couple of months. I have asked for, and I have not yet received, but I've asked for veto power over the translator simply because I want to make sure that the names are pronounced correctly. I've had a lot of experience with audiobooks where the translator makes no effort to find out how these things are, even books about China, where narrated by somebody that you got the impression had never been anywhere near China because every single place name was mispronounced. So I'd like there to be a little quality control on it, but it will be out, and presumably, I think early next year. And we are next year. Early this year.
Or early next year, as the case may be. Two last questions here. Why did they undertake the kidnapping plan? Only for money or for other reasons also?
I'm saying it, I didn't quite catch
Uh,
it.
Why did they undertake the kidnapping plan? Only for money or for other reasons?
Well, again, it kind of gets to the difference in motivation between the Japanese and the Russians. The Japanese wanted the money, they wanted the wealth, but they wanted to keep it quiet because it did not do that didn't do them any good in their prospect for getting Manchuria recognized internationally, for getting the world to see Manchuria as a legitimate independent country and not just the puppet state of Japan. They wanted the money, but they wanted it quiet. The Russians wanted to trumpet it to the skies because these evil Jews who were sympathizing with the communists were enemies of the Russian people, and anything that destroyed them was good for their cause. So there was a conflict there. And so they did basically different motives for it. Did that answer the question? I'm trying to remember what the question was.
Yeah. And the last question, I'd be curious to hear the answer to this. Was his music ever recorded?
Not that I know of, but I have really good descriptions of his concerts that he gave when he was still in Paris. The critics were very, very clear about his technique and what his problems were and how he had improved it from the year before and who his favorite composers were. All of those things I know, but I've never actually heard a recording. I doubt there's one that exists.
Well, Scott, thank you once again for a really engaging, informative, and lesser known story until now that you've presented. And we look forward to your next book. So thanks again for joining us, and hope you'll drop by the center sometime soon so we can meet in person after all this time. I'd also like to thank this evening's producer, Sylvia Peterson, for making all of the work behind the scenes happen. Tonight's program is part of an ongoing series of virtual and live programs presented by and brought to you by the Yiddish Book Center. I hope that you will join us on January 18th at 7 p.m. for our next show, Two Tribes, the story behind the graphic novel with Emily Cohen. Check out our full listing of events, which are plentiful coming up, both in person and online. The calendar of events can be found on our website at www.yiddishbookcenter.org/events. I also want to invite you, if you are in the neighborhood or just ready to take a little bit of a road trip, consider a visit to the Yiddish Book Center to see our newly opened core exhibition, Yiddish, A Global Culture. The center is open Sunday through Friday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. And if you come by, it would be nice to meet you in person rather than just virtually. Again, thanks for joining us. And before I leave you, thanks again to all of our members whose support makes all of our ongoing work possible. Learn more about how you can join or renew. It's the renewal season, and support our work. yiddishbookcenter.org/donate from all of us at the center. Again, thank you for your support. Look forward to welcoming you back on the 18th of January. Until then, stay well, stay happy and healthy. Take care.